So good morning. Is anybody having a good day so far? Man, this has been great so far, hasn't it? I'm just having a great time today, and I'm excited about the rest of the day. Anybody else excited about the rest of the day? I think there's going to be some great things coming today. We get to celebrate my daughter's birthday. We got Sunday night church coming back tonight. I am looking forward to a great day. Now, part of the reason I'm looking forward to a great day may be because I'm wearing my Optimus Prime shirt today. So, and if you can't see it, well, I think we got it up there. So how many of you, I got to take a poll, how many of you know who that guy is, right? All right, that's good. That's like a third of you, okay? So let me educate you uncultured people. So the first time I wore this shirt was actually to a youth event, and a teenager came up to me and said, "Is that a robot on your shirt?" And I said, "That's not a robot. That's a transformer. And it's not any transformer. That's Optimus Prime, the leader of the Autobots," right? But it's not exactly who it is, because I don't know if you noticed this or not, but Optimus Prime is spelled M-U-S when you look at the cartoon or the action figure, but this is M-I-S-T, right? As in, I am the primary optimist in almost every situation I'm ever in. I'm Optimus Prime. And you can ask anybody, right? I'm a very optimistic person. I believe things are going to always work out. It's going to be okay. We'll get through this. It'll be fine. I always think, believe the best. I'm a believe the best kind of a person. I'm always a cup is half full kind of a guy. It's never partly cloudy. It's always partly sunny in my world. So I believe the best about things. I'm an optimist. One of my dearest friends calls me a super optimist, which says sometimes you can't trust me because I'm so optimistic, right? But I like that. I like that I'm a super optimist, and I couldn't find a super optimist shirt, so I settled with the Optimus Prime shirt. And has a robot on it, which is cool, right? So how about you today? I want you to think about this. Are you more an optimist or more a pessimist? Now, chances are you may already know that about yourself. But in case you don't, I'm going to give us a small test today. We're going to have a phrase on the screen, and I want you to just think about how you hear that phrase in your head. Is it up there? Yes. Okay. So some of you today may have heard this phrase this way: "That'll be the day. That's never going to happen." So if that's how you heard that today, guess what? You might be a pessimist. Now, others of us, you may have heard it this way: "That will be the day. It's going to be the greatest day ever." You're with me. You're an optimist if you heard it that way in your head, right? So the former president of the American Psychological Association, Martin Seligman, says, when we experience a setback, a problem in our life, that is often when it really comes out, whether we're an optimist or a pessimist. He says, in a time of a defeat or a setback, an optimist will explain it in a way that is temporary, isolated, and impersonal. An optimist might say things like, "Tomorrow's going to be another day. We can try it again. We'll get them next time. Maybe they were just having a bad day." Pessimists, on the other hand, tend to explain defeats in a permanent, pervasive, personal way. "This always happens. I'm not good at anything. Everyone is against me." And this is so important today as we continue our series in the book of Micah, which will be in Micah chapter 4 here in just a minute. But because as we think about it, our view, whether it's a pessimistic view or an optimistic view, is going to impact how hopeful you are. I've got an image for you here. Anybody recognize this image? This was from Obama's campaign. And this was actually a creation of a street artist named Shepard Fairey. Shepard Fairey was excited about Obama's message of change and hope in a different America, and was so excited that one night he says, "I've got to do something." And so he made this image. He made 700 of these posters, gave it to his team, and in his classic fashion went out graffiti style and posted these all over America for Obama's campaign. And he was a little piece, I think, of Obama eventually winning that campaign. Now, David Litt was another guy who was very inspired by Obama's call to hope and change, and he got involved in the campaign and eventually worked his way up to senior presidential speechwriter. And in his memoir, David Litt talks about the very last day he worked for the Obama administration, just weeks before Donald Trump took the position of president. He said, "I was on Air Force One, and we were flying back to Washington, D.C. I knew it was my last day." And he says, and Obama never gave me a lot of eye contact or FaceTime, but I just felt like I got less that day. And he says, all day, these thoughts and these feelings just kept rolling through my mind. He says, did we really make a difference? Did we really change anything? Is this as good as it's ever going to get? And he says, I walked off that plane onto Washington, D.C., and I just looked around, and I thought, I don't even know where I belong after I walk out of this administration. And he says, in his head, the whole time, these words from Sarah Palin back at the 2010 Tea Party convention rang in his head. So how's that whole hopey, changey thing working out for you? And I think Litt hits upon a really important truth. Optimism itself will never be enough to produce perpetual hope. Just me being an optimist and thinking things are going to work out is never enough to get perpetual hope. So where does hope come from? Well, we're going to be, like I said, over in Micah chapter 4. Actually, we're going to read right at the end of chapter 3 here in a minute. But if you've been with us, we've been working through the book of Micah, Old Testament book, all month long. And if you were to say what you thought about Micah today, you would probably think he was a pessimist. So far, like last week, we read literally what is called a doom oracle. That's not very cheery stuff. You know, so far, everything's been about accusations and judgments and destruction and coming sieging armies. And so it's all been very, very difficult, hard, dark stuff. And right at the end of chapter 3, he's talking about that, and he says this in verse 12. He says, therefore, because of you, Zion will be plowed like a field, Jerusalem will become ruins, and the temple mountain will be a high thicket. So he says, because of our sin and our propensity to not follow God's path and our unwillingness to humble ourselves, he says, it's going to end with the very temple of God being destroyed. That's really positive, right? It's the words of a pessimist. And as he says that, he tells them that even the place where you think God lives is going to be destroyed. And unless God is there, nothing is anything more than a pile of sticks. And yet, 2 generations later, Jeremiah reads this very verse and says, I want us to remember that in the days of Micah that God was a faithful God and he always shows up. How can this message, this verse right here, turn into something that is used to call out people to remember God's faithfulness? Well, I believe it's because of the very next verse, Micah 4, verse 1. It says there, in the last days, the mountain of the Lord's house will be established at the top of the mountains and will be raised above the hills, and people will stream to it. Did you just see Micah make a reversal? Did you see that pessimism suddenly turn to optimism? Did you catch that he said there's going to be a day when the Temple Mountain is going to be a mountain of sticks, but there's coming a day when the mountain of the Lord will be the place where everybody goes to find hope. And it all hinges on this little phrase there, in the last days. Now, as you look through the Bible, that word, that phrase is in there over and over and over again, in the last days, in the last days. And most of the time when we read that, we hear the end of the world, right? That's what you hear when you hear the in the last days. But to a Hebrew audience, that phrase, what it meant was the future just beyond the horizon. It's something just beyond where we can see that we know is coming. And it was this call and this reminder that one day God is going to fulfill all of his promises and he's going to send a Messiah to save us and restore us and set things right. He says, in those last days, this is what it's going to look like. The prophet Hosea, he kind of echoes this when he says this. He says, afterward, the people of Israel will return and seek the Lord their God and David their king, and they will come with awe to the Lord and to his goodness in the last days. And so Hosea saw those last days as being something where all of Israel is gathered back together, but Micah saw it even broader than that. Let's read on here, verse 2. It says, the people will stream to it, and many nations will come and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord and to the house of God, of the God of Jacob. He will teach us about his ways, so we may walk in his paths. For instruction will go out of Zion, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And so in those latter days, Micah says there's going to be this miraculous magnetism, and not just Israel, but all nations are going to come back, and they're going to stream to God, and they're going to ask him to teach them the right way to live. Doesn't that sound great? Isn't that exciting? Don't you long for that day? Isn't that the day you want to see? That's the word of an optimist, isn't it? There's coming a day when everybody's going to turn around and head the right direction. So where does this optimism come from? When Micah was writing this, It was during a time when the Assyrian army had come down from the north and conquered the northern kingdom of Israel and Samaria, and now we're right at the doors, the gates of Jerusalem, and they seem to be an unstoppable force. They seem to be the enemy to end all enemies. And so Israel's sitting there, Jerusalem's sitting there going, what's going to happen next? And this is what Micah says, verse 3. God will settle disputes among many peoples and provide arbitration for strong nations that are far away. They will beat their swords into plows and their spears into pruning knives. Nation will not take up the sword against nation. They will never again train for war. Now, for a lot of people hearing that probably sounds like a fairy tale. Because if you've read the Bible, if you've read history, you know that the nation of Israel was always at war. They were either running from an enemy or running to a promised land, but they were always in crisis. For generations they had to fight. And I was thinking about this week. Right now, there's a war going on in Israel. And it is over the exact same land that they're fighting about all the way back in Micah. The same thing. For 2,700 years, this has been the pattern, the struggle, the strife. And so to say there's going to be a time when there's no war, you might, just like Israel, say that's a fairy tale. That's the words of a super optimist who can't be trusted. But Micah, and what God tells Micah to say, has more teeth to it than just wishful thinking. See, God used Micah to tell them that this nation of Assyria that was there besieging them, they weren't going to win, which seemed impossible. And yet in 701 BC, they failed to take Jerusalem. Somehow, against all odds, the nation of Assyria was not able to breach the walls of Jerusalem. Miraculous. But God told them that's what would happen. And then also through Micah, God tells them that 120 years in the future, that's a long time away, by the way, there's going to come another nation named Babylon, and they are going to beat you, and they are going to destroy the temple, and they are going to carry you away, but guess what? I'm still going to be with you, and I'm going to bring you back. Let's read this here in Micah 4, verse 10. It says, "Rise and cry out, daughter Zion, like a woman in labor. For now you will leave the city and camp in the open fields. You will go to Babylon. There you will be rescued. There the Lord will redeem you from the grasp of your enemies. Many nations have now assembled against you, and they say, 'Let her be defiled, and let us feast our eyes on Zion.' But they do not know the Lord's intentions or understand his plan, that he's gathered them like sheaves to the threshing floor." So he says, even in this siege, even in your exile, even in the destruction of your nation, there's still hope. And so Micah is giving us this message today that in whatever struggle or crisis or strife you're in, that God wants us to see this as a season of preparation. He wants us to see this as a moment for us to learn how to trust him no matter what. That's why the prophet Jeremiah, inspired by Micah and Isaiah's prophecies, tell those people when they are in exile, he says, "For he has sent us word in Babylon, calling the exile will be long. So build houses and settle down and plant gardens and eat their produce. Live your life out here because God's not done with you yet." Recently, I was a part of a seminar, a teaching with Mark Osterreicher, and he's a youth culture expert. And Mark says this about our current culture, that we live in a time of immediacy and disposability. What that means is that we are always quickly running through this thing to the next thing. And we don't hold on to things for very long. So everything's immediate and disposable until we get the next thing. How many of you know what FOMO is? Anybody know what FOMO is? Fear of missing out. And because we have access to so much and we see so much and we can expect so much, we always think that there's something better out there, and so we just get rid of the thing we have currently and move to what we think is the next best thing. And that's everything from the brand new iPhone to the next romantic relationship. We're always thinking something else is going to fill my hope up better than the thing I currently have. But the problem is this: God so often prefers things to be slow and quiet. God takes his time. God develops us. Sometimes it takes generations for God to get people where he needs them to be for his plan to be in fruition. And he reminds us here, even in exile, even in crisis, even in the worst situations you're facing today, know that God has a plan. and that he has a way for us out of whatever we're facing. So how are you today continuing to live in hope in the midst of your own crisis? You know, when we trust God to use our struggle as preparation, we get to look back like those later generations of Israel did and said, you know what? God did exactly what he promised he was going to do. And we get to give him glory and praise when he does that. Well, Micah, again, seeing to the future, seeing to that day, says this, Micah 4, verse 4, "But each person will sit under the grapevine and under his fig tree with no one to frighten him, for the mouth of the Lord of armies has spoken. Though all the peoples each walk in the name of their gods, little g gods, we will walk in the name of the Lord our God, big G God, forever and ever." Now, for Old Testament people, for the Jewish people of the time, that image of a grapevine and a fig tree was that of provision and peace and prosperity that God wanted to give us. And so he says there's coming a day where you'll have more than you need. He says, but in that day, it is those who are faithful and hopeful and truly optimistic that will see the one true God as the true answer. And so it's this period, he says, in this preparation, in this struggle, is a period of purification. You know, we've got a whole lot of little g gods in our world today that are striving for our attention and our wallets and our worship. You know, celebrity and entertainment and success and just good old-fashioned selfishness, right? Like I can be the worst little g for myself, little g god for myself because I think I know what I want. But when we are in a crisis, it's often the pathway for us to see what truly lasts, what's going to truly be the place where we can put our hope. You know, Jesus, right before he went to the cross and he was telling his disciples what was to come next, he said this to them. He says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." It's maybe the most exclusive and intolerant statement ever made in all of history. Because how many ways are there to God? One way. It's only through the person of Jesus Christ. There's only one God. There's not many gods. There's not a whole bunch of gods. There's not a whole bunch of ways. There's one God. And Micah looked forward and he saw that in those last days. He saw that all of these things will only be fulfilled through the Messiah. And Paul writes of this in Philippians when he says this, "For this reason God highly exalted him and gave him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee will bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord to the glory of the Father." And so for us today, are we surrendering and seeking and trusting in the truth of that one true God who sent his Son to die for our sins? Micah ends this section by telling us what that looks like when we do. Picking up here in verse 6, he says, "On that day, this is the Lord's declaration. I will assemble the lame and gather the scattered, those I have injured. I will make the lame into a remnant, those far removed into a strong nation. Then the Lord will reign over them in Mount Zion from this time on and forever." As we've been going through Micah, what we've said is that he's teaching us what it means to be genuinely human, what God requires of us. And as we've done that, we've also been answering some of those big questions of life. Sociologists tell us that every human in existence has to answer three big questions. The question of who am I? That's the question of identity. The question of why am I here? The question of purpose. And the question of where do I fit in? The question of belonging. And historically, that's been the order those have been answered in for most people. So I'm going to figure out who I am, my identity, based upon my family and my community relationships, where I live and who I live around. That's going to help me figure out who I am. And once I figure that out, that's going to help me figure out what I'm supposed to do. That's going to be a part of my family and a part of my community. And so that's my purpose. And once I figured out who I am and what I'm supposed to do, then I feel that sense of belonging in the community God has placed me in. But they're finding a weird thing is going on in this hyper-connected, mobile, ultimate optionality world that we live in today, is that many people are now starting to answer the question of belonging first. That I got to figure out because there's so many options and so many places I could go to find belonging. I'm going to figure out where I belong first, and that's going to tell me who I am and what I'm supposed to do. But remember what Mark Osterreicher said about our culture. It's what? It's immediate and disposable. And so do you see the problem? If my culture is where I'm going to find belonging and it's immediate and disposable, I'm going to live my whole life wondering, when are my friends going to leave me? When is my family going to break up? When is God going to let me down? Because nothing truly lasts in a culture of immediacy and disposability. It may leave us wondering, just like David Litt, how's all that hopey, changey stuff working out for us? But to those questions, God tells us through Micah that there's coming a day when he's going to call the lame and the scattered and the injured and the removed. He's going to call us out of our brokenness, and he's going to gather us into a remnant, and it's a promise of permanence. The only place that we're going to truly find belonging is in the Lord. He's made a place for us. So, how do we embrace this kind of optimism, this perpetual hope that Mike has given us today? You know, as we read the Bible, an interesting thing happens. If you read through the Bible, you're going to see a lot of things repeated over and over again. And anytime you see something repeated in the Bible, that means it's significant and that it's gaining weight and importance in your life. And we've talked about the fact that Micah and Isaiah were both prophesying to the same people at the same time. And it's really interesting, over in Isaiah chapter 2, we see almost word for word the same message that we saw here in Micah chapter 4. This will be on the screen for you. But Isaiah chapter 2, starting in verse 1, says this: "The vision that Isaiah, son of Amoz, saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's house will be established at the top of the mountains and will be raised above the hills, and all nations will stream to it, and many people will come and say, 'Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. He will teach us about his ways so that we may walk in his paths. For instruction will go out of Zion and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He will settle disputes among the nations and provide arbitration for many peoples. They will beat their swords into plows and their spears into pruning knives. Nation will not take up the sword against nation, and they will never again train for war.'" Do you see the words of hope in those words of Isaiah and Micah? And yet Isaiah gives this really interesting end cap to it. Verse 5, he says, "House of Jacob, come and let us walk in the Lord's light." Today, this is what God tells us about finding hope. As we look through those words of Isaiah and Micah, what are the things that it says are going to be the things that bring us hope? Well, first of all, it's the presence of God. No matter whether you're in the best situation of your life or the worst situation of your life, no matter if you have a bright future or if you don't know how you're going to make it through today, Micah tells us that God is with us. Isaiah reminds us that God is going to show up in whatever you're facing today, that he never leaves you and he never forsakes you. You have a God who cares about your situation. They also remind us that we need to look to instruction from God's word. I love what it says here. When all the people come to that mountain, they say, what do they say? They say, he will teach us about his ways so that we may walk in his paths. God has given us a blessed gift of giving us his word, hasn't he? He's taught us what is right and what he requires of us, which is to act justly and love mercy and to walk humbly with him. He's shown us those paths. And so if we want to find hope, this is where we're going to find it. And lastly, we find it in the understanding and acceptance of God's plan. Not my plan, not your plan, not the world's plan, not anybody's plan, but when we recognize that God has a plan and we accept that and submit to it, that's where we're going to find hope. Man, didn't the youth band do a great job today? Yeah. Let's give them a hand. I think they're going to try to put Randall and the guys out of a job, right? They did such a good job. They were excellent today. You know, we are so thankful for the young people at our church, just like Randall said and Tyler said. We are thankful for them not just being here and showing up, but being participative and involved. And an interesting thing is this, you know, a lot of times there's a lot of negative things people want to say about current culture, but Barna research recently in looking at generations found that this generation, the young generation, Generation Z they call them, is the most hopeful generation in modern history. When they ask them questions about the future, more than any other generation before them, it says they are the most likely to believe they can make a difference and that there's a brighter future ahead. Isn't that good news? Don't we need to hear some hope? And we want to encourage that hope, don't we? But here's the thing. Unless this generation finds their hope in the one true God, they're going to wind up being disillusioned. And so we have to keep passing this message on. We have to keep offering something that's not empty and temporary or disposable or immediate, but something that's going to last forever, a perpetual hope, and that only comes through God's presence and his word and his plan. For every generation, all of us today, if you're struggling with hope and lean towards pessimism, I believe what Micah would tell you to do today is do something different. If we keep finding ourselves in this negative feedback loop, then we got to change that loop, or we're never going to get out of this situation. So what do you need to do new today? Maybe for some of us, we need to submit to God's ways and say, God, I admit that my ways aren't the best ways, but I believe yours are the best ways, and I'm going to obey them. It's not always easy to obey, is it? But God has given us commands and principles and pathways that he wants us to follow. And if we want to find true hope and freedom, we have to say yes to the ways that God has put before us. We also have to learn from his word. And maybe for some of us, that's the new thing you need to do, is that you need to start mining this Bible and find out what God truly says. I've made it a habit in my life to most days to get up early and to read the Bible. And that's what we've been encouraging you all year to do. To make space 5 days a week to read from the Bible. And not just so we can say, I read the Bible, I did that, but so we have this habit of listening to God. Every morning when I read the Bible, I pray this prayer. It's out of Psalm 119. I say, God, open my eyes that I might see wondrous things in your instructions so I might know you better and follow you better today. That's the heart of Micah's message. That is what we need to do if we want to find true hope. And lastly, maybe the new thing we need to do is to trust in his plan. Maybe you've been trying to figure it all out. Maybe you've been looking all around to try to find answers for the struggles of your life or our world. You're waiting for that magic answer, and here's the thing. God has a plan. We don't always see it immediately. And as we saw in Micah, sometimes it's generations away when we see that restoration, but we got to trust that God is in charge and that he's got a plan and he's moving and orchestrating things so that we'll one day see that day that's promised here in the Bible. For the 8th century Judean Hebrews, they faced a hopeless situation. An unbeatable army was coming to destroy everything they knew. But even in their eventual loss, those who were faithful, those who trusted, they found that wasn't a defeat, but that really was an advance for them to see God more clearly. And for us today, in whatever crises we're facing, we've got to realize there's coming a day when God's going to right wrongs and restore things, but that comes through us surrendering our lives to God through his son, Jesus Christ. Next week, we're going to come back and we're going to look at that eternal ruler, the one true shepherd king who is the person of Jesus. But today, I want to ask you, what is it that you need to do to find perpetual hope? I don't know how you walked in here today. Maybe some of you walked in here today and you felt pretty hopeless. And you have things that you don't know how you're going to see your way through it. Others of you, maybe you came in here today trusting your own ability and determination to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Maybe others of you came in here today waiting for that big break, that right relationship, or the right politics to come together to fix all the problems of your life in the world. But those things are empty and temporary sources of hope. And so for us today, will you admit your need for a Savior, that you can't do it on your own? Will you acknowledge your allegiance to the one true God and say, God, I don't want anything to compete with you in my life? And will you commit to being a super optimist who knows that one day sin and struggle is going to be defeated and that God is going to give us victory? And won't that be the day? Would you guys stand with me?